Hi, I'm Zach. Today I want to explore the value that language and dialects of languages bring. When you think of how many individual dialects and accents there are within the English language alone, Brooklyn, Boston, Jamaican, Aussie, that Southern drawl, that Valley Girl Brittany, Cajun, Pidgin, Newfoundlandese, that cute girl and guy from Europe, or that hometown flavor only you and your crew can speak. There's a reason why we carry all that flavor in our voices. Family and culture. Our words carry knowledge and feeling from our environments. According to UNESCO, there are 6,700 languages in the world today, and 40% of those are starting to decline or disappear entirely. Once a language disappears or goes to sleep, so does all the knowledge it carries. My next guests are both artists, linguists, and culture keepers from Qualicum and Squamish, BC. They've been working hard in schools to teach the next generation Halkominum and Squamish languages. They have also been tackling the resurrection of a sleeping Coast Salish language called Puntlatch that was traditionally spoken where I currently live on Vancouver Island in Canada. There are no known fluent speakers of Puntlatch, but that hasn't stopped them from using dialects or other languages, and even learning German to help translate very old documents created by anthropologist explorer Franz Boas. Their commitment to their culture is so inspiring and exactly what kind of dedication coastal Canada needs to keep the knowledge alive and our fire high. These are people that I hope the government or a benefactor will get behind to continue their work and connect them with the resources they need to make it count for future generations. Until then, I want to raise them up as far as I can. I hope you enjoy this interview discussion with Jesse Recalma and Ocean Hyland. I'm Zach Whyte, and this is The Ranger Cabin.
So my contemporary name, the name I was born with, Jesse Recalma. I am a member of the Qualicum First Nation. I sort of got roots running around everywhere, from all the way over to Musqueam to Nanoose to Fort Rupert to Swinomish. Sort of depends on how far back we feel like going, but...
Where is Swinomish?
Swinomish, that's down by LaConner, Washington.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a nice little place, if you ever...
Yeah, LaConner's lovely.
Yeah. My traditional name is Whyte. Whyte. It was a name given to me by my late grandfather, Gordon Reed. It was my mom's dad. And so I was told that you could sort of translate that as either Tanglefoot or Noisy in the Bush.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How did you get that name? Why did that seem appropriate?
It was through a ceremony, sort of when I came of age, and my grandfather decided that he just wanted to share his name with me. It was given to him by a blind man who was half Hawaiian from Lummi. So the name itself comes from Lummi, and so his name was Charlie Kahana, and he gave that name to my grandpa. That name often gets confused with my grandpa's brother's name, which is Halkominum, which is a different name. So you can sort of tell, like with a lot of our words, that there's some that are so close, they have to make sure you're pronouncing it correctly. Otherwise, you're saying a completely different word, or a completely different name.
Yes. There's a lot of that, especially between dialects. There's words that sound very similar but mean completely different things. And, I mean, it happens in English too.
Yeah.
So how about you, Ocean?
Yeah, my name is Ocean Hyland, and I'm a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I carry the ancestral name Tsimtalot, and I share that with my mother, which is actually quite an old name. It comes down through my mother's father, through his mother, from the mountain range out in Chiam, out in the Fraser Valley, that big mountain range out there. There's, I think, about 7 peaks. So that has been passed down to me through my mother, through my grandpa. On my grandpa's side, he's from Chiam. When I was born, my mom had a dream of me that I was like this little eagle that spread out, and she had shared that story with my grandpa. And in his family, you give names at different stages of life, and so when you're born, you get your baby name or your pet name, and that's what you're called when you're a child and you're growing up. So my papa called me Mimoch, which means small bird, and so I had that name until I was a bit older, and then they gave me Timtalot to carry that name. And then when I was in the language program through SFU, learning the Squamish language with my classmates, it was an immersion program, so you weren't allowed to speak English. And so a lot of people, we would either use our ancestral names or kind of translate our names into like the Squamish version, because sometimes there's like not R's in the language. So it would take like those letters out and then just like shorten people's names or give them nicknames in the language. And so people would call me Shquen, which it doesn't necessarily translate to ocean, but it's like the closest kind of translation that we had. So there's a few people that call me that as well. So I've some various different names that I carry and use at different times. And as an artist, sometimes I'll use the name Shquen, because that was kind of around the time that I was kind of developing myself as an artist and breaking out into public art and feeling more comfortable in that way. And so I used that name as my artist name as well. But yeah, I'm a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, but I have, same as Jesse, roots, the same as a lot of us, roots that spread out far. On my mother's side, I am Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish and Chiam and Hawaiian and Chinese. And then on my father's side, I'm Scottish and Irish. So a good mix in there of lots of different places. But for the most part, I grew up at...
You're universal. That's awesome.
But growing up, I grew up at Tsleil-Waututh and lived most of my life there. And I've been in Qualicum for about 1.5 years now and love it here. It's so beautiful being so close to the river and so close to the ocean. And like you said, when you first got here, it's so quiet here. Just hear the ravens flying around when the fish are in the river. And
I've got Pikachu holding my back. The Pikachu pillow.
The handy pillow.
You grew up in this house, Jesse?
I did.
How does that?
I did.
Is that kind of weird? Do you feel like you can't escape, or what's the feeling?
It's weird and then also familiar. So there's definitely like ways in which I have to detach myself from my 8-year-old self, from making it our space now as opposed to just my space. There's like a lot of things I find I'm letting go of, ways in which I sort of remind myself that this is my house now and I can do with it what I want.
Is that true, Ocean?
Yeah.
Couples therapy. Here we go.
You've lived in many different spaces in this house, and you've had many different tenants and many different, like at one point the house was like separated. Like there was a living space on that side and a living space on that side. And so there's like a kitchen over here before, but now there's not a kitchen over here.
Oh, okay.
And so you've seen the house change in many different ways. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he's like even let me cut the studio in half and I get one side.
Hey, what a guy.
Slightly pushing the shelf more and more.
So my carving space is getting a little tighter now. She did that to me one day.
That's funny.
I came in and I was like, she's like,
do you notice anything?
Do you notice it? Yeah. And I'm like, no.
Where's all my tools?
I noticed a bunch of my stuff's moved over, but
it's all out on the front lawn. Ocean, what are you learning from being here?
In Qualicum?
Yeah. Because you're out of your hometown.
Yeah. There's like how we've kind of talked about, like language is very similar, concepts are very similar, but also very different. just noticing like the differences of this community compared to my community. Like the food harvesting is still so alive here in Qualicum. Like the river becomes alive when the salmon come. Like everybody's down at the river fishing, and there's people that hunt here and there's people that forage, and it's so much more accessible, and people dig clams and are a bit more connected to those cycles. Whereas back where I'm from, we're right on the edge there of like our territory feels like it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because there's so much development popping up around. Like clam harvesting isn't accessible anymore to our community. Like traditionally it was 90% of our diet was from the shorelines and from the ocean and seafood. And then the other 10% is like wild game and berries and plants and whatnot like that. But nowadays we can't even harvest from the shores like around our community.
Yeah.
Because of pollution and lack of like clean land and clean water. And so back home, it's like our things that we have held on to is a lot different than the things that they've held on to here. And so seeing that difference is interesting because then I get to see so much more of land-based learning about food, whereas back home I could only really talk about it in theory. I could talk about, traditionally we used to go dig clams there, and there was a really good berry patch there, but it's not there anymore because they tore it down. But here it's like you can go, there's a really good berry patch right here, and then go pick the berries. Or the salmon arrive here at this time, and then you actually go to the river and see the salmon arriving, whereas back home it's like our creeks are all polluted and the fish there's no fish anymore. So we could talk about it in theory, but here we get to see it.
It is really, and it's an important thing to talk about, because what is it that you can bring with you that makes you Indigenous? And when the food and the activities are gone, that's a huge portion of the day that would have been a traditional way of doing things. And so the things that are left are art. So the way the art is presented, and this is why cultural appropriation or use of art outside of an Indigenous artist, for example, that's an important topic to talk about as well, is art or form line or certain techniques being taken by or adopted by other artists who may not have the rights and title to use certain crests or draw certain things. And the reason it is such a hot topic is because that is a big chunk of what helps the identity and be Indigenous. The other parts would be, of course, cultural practice, songs, regalia, ceremony, the way of doing things, rites of passage, and all those types of things. And then the big one, which you're both working on, language. And those are the core pieces of identity that you have. And if it feels like, I see arguments going like, what does it matter? All artists steal. All artists are taking something from everybody. But in this case, I am like super defensive in that, no, it needs to be protected because it is a core part of the identity that has been taken, for the last 400, 500 years of colonization.
I like the way that you broke that down when you're like, if we don't have access to the food we eat, how many times a day do we eat? If we don't have access to the land that provides that food, what do we have left in the day? And like we were talking about, like how do you be true to yourself as an Indigenous person and carry out your day and honor and respect that? And I guess like what we were saying, like how do we carry this work forward every day? And I think something similar that Jesse and I both acknowledge is those ceremonies of greeting the day. Like in our culture, we have ways of starting our day and honoring the day in different ways. And I've heard from different people, like one of my mentors once shared with me, one of the ways some of the older women would greet the day is they'd go and sit out on their porch and they would weep and they would cry and they'd release all of those tears, any of those heavy feelings, any of those prayers that they had about what was happening in life at that time. letting go of grief from people that have passed, or grieving that heaviness from any difficulties they may be having. And they'd release those and they'd cry, and then they'd go back in and they'd wash off their face, wash off their tears, and they'd start their day. And that's where they would hold all of that grief and heaviness, was at that beginning of the day, and they'd release it so that they could move forward through their day without any of those heavinesses carried throughout any of the things that they were doing to that day, like if they're cooking or if they're going and harvesting medicine. Like that was their way of releasing and making sure that they were taking care of themselves when they first woke up. And so we have various different ways of greeting the day, like different songs or different things that we go do at the beginning of the day. So I liked that question of like, well, what is left in the day? And I was like, well, at the very beginning of a day, there is those ways that we take care of ourselves and make sure that we start out in a good way.
So do you start the day, I don't know if you want to share this, but do you start the day with a song?
I don't, but I do definitely, like, from my mom, remember, like, when you wake up, you say the things you're grateful for, or like try and start your day off with that mindset of like that gratitude and releasing of any heaviness that you may do, because you want to put your best self forward as much as you can, and to remember the different ways to take care of yourself so that you can make it possible for yourself. Because there's definitely many things that can make us feel heavy and upset and not want to move forward. But in our culture, there's many different ways to reground yourself, like being out in nature or connecting with family, ways to take care of yourself so that you could always do the best work that you know how.
How do you feel about that best work idea? Or is it putting your best foot forward all the time? Is that something you're motivated to do?
I think so, because that is something that I've been taught since I was little, that my mom would always say. My Uncle Bob said to her mom's brother, my Uncle Bob, always give 110%, no matter who you work with, where you are, or what you're doing. And always do your best, because when you stand up and you say, I am Ocean and I'm from Tsleil-Waututh, that is who you're representing. And so how can you represent that? Because I would be told, you've been given the tools to do that, so that's what you have to do.
Do you carry your ancestors with you, Jesse?
I definitely do my best to, because it's kind of like that way of saying thanks, because we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing without their guidance and their support and their whole way of being. We wouldn't have our knowledge without them having passed things along. So they took all that time hundreds of years ago or decades ago or the other day to put all that little bit inside you. They put that bit inside our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and they all put that bit down into our parents, and then our aunts and our uncles and our older cousins, and they all put that stuff down into us. So I always try to think about whenever I do my work, I'm not just doing my work for me, I'm doing my work for my family, I'm doing my work for my community. And so all that stuff is a reflection of not just myself, but sort of everyone who stood beside me or behind me or in front of me. And remember that all this stuff that's being shared with me isn't mine. I just sort of belong to it. And that time's going to come where I have to be passing that knowledge down too. I'm just holding on to it. I don't own it. I'm just a part of it. I'm just holding it. So when I think about that type of knowledge, that's sort of how I try to maintain the work that I do. I try to hold it in that way.
When you're working on your artwork, do you find you are putting energy into it that way, or is it purely a kind of a creative pursuit and playful pursuit?
I think sometimes it can be a spectrum of both. When I was doing my mentorship with Aaron Nelson Moody, he's from the Squamish Nation, he had kind of demonstrated that the roles and responsibility as an artist in our communities, in our culture, in our ways of being. Like Jesse said, I don't own the skill of being an artist. I belong to it, and that's what I carry forth. And so having that mixture of having that creative pursuit of seeing the world the way I see it and interpreting that and sharing that with the world. And then also upholding the people in my life, in my family, and the people I choose to be around, upholding them with the gift that I'm a part of, like offering up my skills when needed. Like, I don't know if Jesse would share of all the times that he's carved something or created something and just gifted it to someone and not expected anything in return. And that was something that was kind of shown to me through my mentorship, is because you've been honored with this gift and this connection, to share in that, to not be greedy to yourself of it's all mine, or I'm just gonna only do this for myself. But then, like how we've talked about the people that inspire us, of honoring that inspiration that people give us and sharing back with them and sharing in that joy of life that we have, our joy of art, a joy of creating, being as generous as we can with that. Because it's like traditionally the way artists were taken care of was they would be hired to create something, and then they would be hosted or supported by those people. They'd feed them, they'd take care of them, they'd spend time with them, or let them work in their space, make sure that they were taken care of, make sure that they were looked after while they were doing that work of like carving a house post for a longhouse, or making a canoe for somebody, or weaving a shawl or something. They'd be taken care of because they were doing that special work for those other people. But nowadays, the way that we live, it's a bit harder to do that. And so we have to figure out how to carry on that teaching of being generous and doing things out of love and appreciation.
Right. I love that. It's become very transactional.
Yeah.
Art, right? The idea of giving and giving to people, or that's what I love mostly about the cultural community, is that you can gift something, and that has massive ripples. You know, I've been gifted things and just been like, whoa, what do I possibly, my first thought isn't like, it is gratitude, but it's also like, what can I do? What can I do? How can I give? And how can I contribute? And how can I give that same feeling, that same overwhelming feeling to somebody? How about you, Jess? Do you find that in creating your art and how you carry yourself and bringing yourself to your name, I guess, might be another way to, do you actively kind of go through a process like that, putting your name on and filling it?
Yeah, I'd say so. Because most of where I go, people recognize me. Like if I go to the district, or I go to smokehouse, or if I go to the coffee shop, like there's usually somebody that knows who I am. They're like, "Oh, you're Bill's son, aren't you?" Or,
Right.
"Oh, you're Carrie's boy," or "Oh, you're Gordon's grandson, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah." So
There's no getting away from that.
There's no getting away from that. No, I even go down to Victoria when I went to UVic there, and still there's people who recognize my name and go to the coffee shop, and it turns out that's the coffee shop my dad went to. Oh yeah, you're Ogie's boy, aren't you? And that's kind of part of being Indigenous is no matter sort of where you go, you carry a reputation with you. And that's, where it's important to really carry along your teachings as best you can, because somebody's going to recognize you. You go out to Saskatchewan or somewhere, and so my mom's worked out there before, so somebody out there, oh, I knew your mom, and I got my uncle lives up in the Yukon, so like that's a small town. So no matter where I go, there's somebody there who probably knows someone in my family, and so.
Is that a good thing?
I sure hope so.
I have the same thing.
Yeah.
When people say, "Oh, I know your uncle," and I'll be like, "Which one?"
If it's this one, I don't know them.
Which way is this story gonna go?
Yeah. Because we've had people in our families who might not have carried our names in a good way, and that's the way things have been historically too. Like our people historically have had uncles or relatives who've done things that the rest of the family is not really proud of, And kind of like that work then is that you got to sort of be better than that. Like your kind of mandate's almost to fix it. When you have that level of respect around in somewhere, like, you wouldn't have, when you travel somewhere, you wouldn't have to travel hungry, because you could go anywhere and you'd have if somebody knows and respects you, then they'll make sure you're looked after.
Absolutely.
And yeah. Like that's, I think, sort of a bit of the difference between the social structures of Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw. Like there's not sort of the same levels of hereditary chieftainships in the way that things sort of happen further north. Historically, there were a lot of similarities, but so much has changed amongst our family structures now, with people not understanding sort of like how different kinship models work. I know, like in the old days too, just to go on this little tangent, but I swear it's connected.
I love tangents.
like nowadays we're connected a lot differently than we were back in the day. Instead of Facebook, we had our canoes in the oceans, and we had our potlatches, our namings and memorials and everything. And I know even like now we think of the potlatches up north. They'll have them in a weekend, and they'll spend 16 hours on a Saturday, going well into 4:00 Sunday morning to do their work. But I know a friend of mine from up there that I was at school with in Victoria. He'd tell me that like even back in the day, like they wouldn't do all of that work in one day. They'd have that entire potlatch over the course of a week.
Yeah.
So they just do one little bit one day, and then everybody would go and then get all the food ready, do all their socializing and whatnot.
You can really get to know people at the potlatch, because that's the biggest complaint I hear now is ceremonial work. It's like, it's work.
I don't get to visit with anybody.
Yeah, you're working.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the same for a lot of us too. Like we had that was sort of how you made your connections. You go to these places and you go to socialize. You'd spend time with other people. When we were talking sort of about our introversion, extroversion sort of our details, like I think
our ways of being modeled that quite well. Like you could spend lots of time with people, and then you're pretty isolated and back home.
But there's that spending that time with friends and family that just feels so good and rewarding. You'd have your friends and family back in the day based on carrying yourself in a good way.
Yes.
And I think like when I bring that back to us as artists and language workers, we have to carry ourselves in a good way. As artists, if we don't carry ourselves in a good way, no one's gonna want our art, because all of that we put that part of ourselves in our work, and if we're not putting that squallow and that good feeling in there, the people are gonna pick up on it. They're like, oh, I don't want that. And sure, it looks good, but I don't want it on my wall. And then too, like with our language work, we have to be really open and sharing, because we don't know who's going to be out there to help us. We don't know who's going to be out there to be like, oh yeah, I'll be right there, and we'll go through that word list together.
You're building an emotional connection with people, and I try and do that everywhere I go. That's actually the only the thing that I find interesting in life actually is just that magic between two people, or a connection, or a thing, or a story, right? Like just obsessed with stories. So to have the idea of carrying yourself and presenting yourself, it almost is all about just creating more opportunity for more of those like more of those moments of connection. And people will hang ugly things on their wall if they feel connected to it.
If it makes them feel good, then they're going to put it there.
And even better if it looks good.
Yeah.
Like the art I'm seeing. So, right? But I think that carrying yourself can be very purposeful. And maybe it's something that we often forget as well as people, and we constantly need to be reminded of, is like carrying yourself shouldn't be work. Carrying yourself and living in yourself is actually about opening yourself up to those connections. And I think even introverts need to be connected.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you're connecting and sharing and contributing through your work, that is a connection. Even if you're holed up in a studio for days on end, or in Jesse's case, out on the front lawn.
Yeah.
So much of our culture is ingrained within our language. And the way that we sort of understand our relations to one another is through our language. Like even though Ocean and I studied working on different languages, like me starting off with Halkaliitnam and Ocean doing Squamish, where there's so many similarities in terms of words and ways of understanding who we are and how we are. You know, once we started working on our Puntlatch language revitalization project, that there's been quite a bit of Squamish knowledge that sort of really helped understand a lot more of this Puntlatch work. So,
and is that through structure and how
like the concepts that
right
are translatable? It gets a bit muddy in English, but then once we talk about like Squamish concepts, way of being, and then that is easily translatable into Halkaliitnam ways of being or Puntlatch ways of being and concepts of understandings of like the world around us. Like, for example, Jesse and I have worked a lot on like moon cycles and seasonal rounds and ways of observing the world around you and understanding those concepts. Like the moon phase that we're at right now was Huasalanoch, which means like the leaves falling, like the wind blowing the leaves off the tree. And then the next one would be
Tumquatlo,
which is about the salmon in the river. And so those concepts and ways of understanding the world around us are very relatable to think about, like, oh yeah, at this time of the season we'd be here and fishing and whatnot like that. And then translating that into art, because sometimes, like you were just saying, rights and title and treaty is so hard to understand. But if I made a painting or a drawing of someone fishing at the river in a certain space of our territory, that is a lot more understandable, right? Like that can kind of make more sense. You can look at that, and a lot of different people, all ages, all backgrounds, can look at that and have some level of understanding of like, oh, in the fall you're at the river and you're in this part of the territory, and then I can even add in a drawing of the type of house that would be built in that part of the territory at that time of the year. And that can help you understand our way of living and our way of being a bit more than reading through these complex documents that are made for us not to understand and made to hold us back in that way of not understanding. But I think that's such the big drive behind being an artist and incorporating language. It's that understanding of way of being and our way of understanding of knowing how to share that and incorporate that into our everyday life, which is such a useful tool, that art in that language. And our way of navigating this world that we live in, of interacting with people, is that it can be translatable and understandable in a nonverbal way. Like when you look at it, you can understand.
Were there similarities? You were saying there's similarities between the languages. What did you learn when you started digging into these?
A lot of aha moments. Like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
You have sort of like the root words, and then you have the different suffixes and prefixes that sort of put something together. Like the word for morning, natus, is actually rooted in the word night. Nate, snit, nate. Well, nate is like to become late. Snit is like the night. But the that's like a suffix that means something that is past. So it could be something that happened before, or it could be something that is like someone who has passed. Like for my grandfather, I'd refer to him as Hualchinamas, and that's like to note that he's passed. So then you kind of realize that word we use for morning is actually just kind of like night has passed. Yeah. So it's like, oh, well, that makes sense.
Or like what we did the other day.
Yeah.
Where I was trying to draw the salmon cycle in the curriculum that we're writing in the school district. I was wanting to make like a chart of the salmon cycle, and we couldn't find the word for Eilevin in Halkaliitnam, but I knew of the word in Squamish, and so I couldn't remember how to spell it, and I couldn't find it in the dictionary right away. So I messaged one of my teachers. I was like, oh, and then Jesse thought what he found was the root word. So the word in Squamish is skukimelo. And so we're trying to figure out, what is the root word? What is that concept? Like, is that translatable, that concept? And then Jesse found what he thought to be the root word, which was to breastfeed. And so I asked one of my teachers, I sent him a picture. I was like, because he doesn't translate a lot, I had to like ask him. I was like, Nathlo to root snachum to skukimelo. Like, is this the root word for this Elavin, like that breastfeeding word? He goes, I don't know. And then he told me how to properly spell it. So then we're looking at that, and then he found what he thought to be the root word, which was similar. And so and then there's a suffix at the end of it, was like to do with its quella, the stomach. So it's like it breastfeeds from the stomach. And so that was the concept behind that word and how it was put together and built and thought of. And so we found that root word in Hulkameetnam, and we found that suffix in Hulkameetnam, and we put that together. It's skimeo.
Skakameus.
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 So it's the same concepts and root words and suffixes, just translated between the two. And that was a really exciting moment where it was like, maybe we just didn't find the word in the dictionary right away, but we translated that concept for Elavin into Hulkameetnam.
Because there's
a fun moment.
There's like a lot of things that like especially with the Puntlatch work, there's a very limited amount of data that we have on the Puntlatch language. Like amongst the Coast Salish languages, the things that make them Coast Salish languages is that they're all related in some way. So even though like Squamish, has that language, Hulkameetnam has that language, Puntlatch has that language, Shishat has that language, Iajutham and Iajusam have that language. They're all related significantly in terms of how their words are structured and how their grammar is structured, and a number of sort of the way that they refer to things. Some are more similar to others, like Hulkameetnam and Hulkameetnam are quite similar. There's even quite a bit of similarity with Hulkameetnam and Squamish, and similarities between Hulkameetnam and Lummi. One of the things that we've found is that you can take a sentence in Puntlatch and sort of easily translate a similar concept in Squamish or Shishat or Hulkameetnam, but you can't do the same with a sentence in Kwakwala and say like Hulkameetnam. In cases where there's words borrowed, like they're nouns. If they're a borrowed word, it's a noun. It's not a verb because you can't conjugate the verb the same way. Huh. So,
and the analogy you came up with in the car the other day when we were driving, you're like, it's kind of like Puntlatch is those 3D pictures, where you can't quite see them, but then when you put on those like red and blue glasses, it starts to clear. And the red and blue glasses is all those different languages that are slightly similar but not exactly the same. And when you put those on, it can kind of help you see Puntlatch a little bit more clear.
Yeah.
Your pursuit of taking on so many different languages or dialects now, learning just one language or revitalizing one language is difficult. Mm-hmm. But I love that you're seeing benefit in doing multiple. But why is it important? Why does language matter to you at all?
So that's like a question that like in some ways I sometimes feel stumped answering it, because working in schools once in a while you get a kid going, why are we learning this? Why bother doing that if nobody else is going to speak it? There's that connection with identity and language. So the way that that we would say conduct a ceremony, like some people would say that you have to use the language in order to conduct that ceremony. And when we have something like Puntlatch and sort of people sort of carry on with like the description of it being like, extinct or sleeping, it's kind of like they think, oh, well then like those people are sort of extinct or sleeping. But there's still like, quite a number of people around with Puntlatch descent. Some here, some in Comox, some in Nanaimo, some in Cowichan, some in Stimutnus. And I'm sure there's even like, more on the mainland connections, probably old connections with Squamish and Shishat, and like Iajutham is like Slam and whatnot as well. So when people read like, that sort of like this dialect is gone, they sort of assume that the people are gone. And then when we try to say that, no, actually our language is awake because so many of these words are being used in other languages. So all these other languages have these shared words. And essentially the work that we're doing with this is we're showing that we're not quite so dead as a lot of people like sort of have that perception of. We're not like, so extinct as so many people have tried to say.
That's the most optimistic thing I've heard, actually, in learning the other languages around it or using the resources that are available to be able to revitalize something like a Puntlatch language is very cool.
And
That's very cool. I mean, it's really exciting, actually.
And like sort of the political part of it too. Like one of the biggest arguments against us Indigenous peoples as like being here is the way the government of Canada and British Columbia operate is they say that they don't support the terra nullius sort of argument about the province and the country being here, but their legal structure says otherwise. So a lot of people really realistically, like, you know, even in the more social context outside of the actual government structure, sort of legitimize like a colonization and settlement as under the guise of terra nullius of their, well, these people aren't here anymore, so we don't have to worry about looking after their archaeological sites.
Right.
But like we're a small community here, and we share like most of our overlapping territory with Comox and Nanus and a bit of Hapatchisitt, and sort of out on the islands with Slammon and Seashell. But the reality is, like, you know, we are still here, and like our presence is still legitimized, and having that language at work is something that I think helps supports that growth in that direction. A lot of people like to assume what we know, and for a lot of people, it's taken a long time to sort of be comfortable with being Indigenous. These other people get to a point in time where they think, okay, now I'm really comfortable to know things, so I'm going to ask everybody everything. Without sort of consideration of sort of how comfortable people might actually be in terms of what they know. And like I'm not thinking of, like, you know, myself in this point, just because I've had to do a lot of work with the school district over the past number of years already. But people sort of, you know, coming up to my cousin and I in the workplace and being like, oh, so can you, like, you know, teach our class Halkamitam right now? And it's kind of like, well, it's not really that simple.
Yeah, it's very complex.
Yeah,
it's an entire language.
Yeah, there's like a lot of things that like they're like, oh, can you just tell us your creation story right now? And so it's like a level of exploitation in a way.
Yeah.
And it is a lot of people, I think, like legitimately curious, but it's, you know, recognizing that we're all in a different state of decolonization and understanding ourselves, and so it gets to be, for a lot of people, like it's a lot of work to ask them how comfortable they are with their language, because for a lot of people, language has been a really difficult journey,
which is traumatizing in itself.
Yeah,
I talked with Keisha Everson about this in a previous podcast, and she was saying the largest thing when she's teaching language at the college is taking care, because people are quite frustrated that language has been taken and they're having to learn it and maybe can't, like maybe don't have the ability academically to learn it, or can't pronounce it quite the right way. And so that frustration causes or brings up trauma. And that, to me, like what you're talking about, is a very important concept to, as we are moving forward, you know, with reconciliation, that not everybody is an expert in their culture or in their field or in their language. And everyone, I think you articulated it so beautifully by saying everyone's in a different phase of decolonization. Maybe some people don't want to decolonize either. So there's the whole spectrum there, but also important not to exploit people by saying, educate me on you're a person now. So tell me what that means to you. Right?
Yeah.
I ask a lot of questions myself, and I'm just generally a super curious person, but that to me has been a very important concept to learn early in our adventure of this rebuilding Canada. Is kind of how I look at it, as like rebuilding Canada with also the potential for over 600 plus nations within in the border of what Canada is or understood to be. That's 3 times more countries than there are in the world right now. Yeah. So that's not like a small pursuit. And it's delicate and important not to, I think it's a multi-generational pursuit.
Oh, definitely.
Right? Yeah. I think we're at this really important phase right now, historically, in that we have to lay the foundation work for each other to be able to do this. And I think that opportunity is so exciting. I heard my friend Gilly Darabi, who's a correspondent for Vice magazine and a bunch of Al Jazeera, and she's done some work all over the world. Same thing in Afghanistan and some fledgling kind of countries that are going through instability but then rebuilding themselves. It's kind of like a similar path. And I love this. She said, this generation is the warriors. The next generation is going to be the healers, because we're bringing our kids up with this understanding, a greater gentleness, a wider acceptance of different ways of living and different cultural lifestyles and all of the identity things that we as kids maybe didn't have access to. But I feel like our role is very much, or I feel my role anyways, is very much a warrior-based role, in that it's time to break things and time to lay the groundwork to restructure them. Have you thought about legacy?
Oh, yeah. Like, especially in the language work, when I was studying with some of my friends and my cousins, it's like we got to listen to these old recordings of like our great grandparents' generation speaking and telling stories and stuff like that. And sometimes we would record ourselves when we're like working and doing stuff, or like trying to get a concept into like a recording, and so that we could hold on to that or use that in other ways. And then like sometimes it would get silly and we'd be like, okay, no, you can't say it like that. Like your grandchildren are going to be like, well, my grandpa said this, and like take that as the way to say it, when really we're just like goofing around. And so putting this out there in a permanent way, then hopefully it's my the best version of myself that gets left behind.
It sounds like you have that full respect when you're putting your art out. Does that limit you?
I guess so sometimes. Yeah, there's some art that I was like, oh yeah, I wouldn't. But there's definitely time for fun, like when you just do art for yourself, things for fun, or silly, goofy things.
That's how you grow too, right? What about you, Jesse? Do you find legacy is at the top of your mind? Or what would you like to leave as your legacy is maybe a better question.
I would say that like legacy is 100% the reason for doing language work. And you know, I don't think of it as my legacy, but I think of it as our legacy. It's our obligation to share our language as our legacy, because like, you know, sort of each generation gets smaller and smaller of fluent speakers, and already Puntlatch has already been sort of labeled as extinct. So I guess now with that, the legacy for that is the intention to keep it alive, or to show that it wasn't as extinct as people were saying that it was, and sort of keeping that work going. But also like in terms of art, like, you know, communities sort of generally have their continuing artists, and, you know, it would sort of really warm my heart immensely if, you know, I see any of my nieces and nephews taking up either after Ocean or myself, or even just taking up art with another mentor that sort of takes them under their wing. Artists themselves are like, we're almost our own sort of community in a way, and we wouldn't always just learn like, you know, from someone within your community. It might be somebody who lives like Ocean saying that her mentorship with Aaron Nelson Moody, and I know she also worked with her uncle out in Chehalis, even though he himself's from Tsleil-Waututh. Like he
has a great name too. What's his name?
Splash.
Oh, is it? It's not Zach George.
Zach George. Yeah.
Great name.
Yeah. And I think for me, like in a way, it's important for me because I didn't take on any mentorship. Like I'm mostly self-taught in the work that I do, and so a lot of the knowledge I have is knowledge that I just picked up from having conversations here and there with other more renowned artists. I had a couple of good conversations with Bo Dick and Bill Henderson, and I always think of even Carver. You know, Carver gave me one of the most important teachings that I learned at the beginning of my career.
That's Carver Everson.
It's Carver Everson, yeah. It is and when you're carving, don't forget to breathe. And I didn't realize sort of what exactly he meant till I was like there working away and oh right. And so yeah,
that's fundamental.
Yeah, it's fundamental. You know, it's also like, you know, metaphorical. Like, don't forget to take that time to just, you know, relax. But then also at the same time, literally, don't forget to breathe.
Yeah.
So I always keep that in my mind, and I try to acknowledge, like, when someone like that shared with a piece of knowledge with me, where it came from, so that when I go to pass it on, I can pass on that information and I can cite my source. Like, oh yeah, Carver taught me this. Don't forget to breathe, and Bill taught me don't be stingy with your work. And then my other cousin Ray Sim, I more so think of him as my brother. He's live with us for a while here. You actually see quite a bit of his work in the house. Some of his prints. The front door was painted by him when he was first starting out as an artist. He referred to that as his way of paying rent. He would say, "Don't be afraid to be picky with your wood," because a lot of times you got people going to offer you like pieces of wood, like, "Oh, I got this great little wood you can use to carve with," and then
it's full of knots.
It's full of knots. It's flat grain, and it's just not going to do what you want it to do. And so his teaching was, you don't be afraid to be like you want your work to be something you can be proud of, and that can be something really difficult to be proud of if we just can't work around those knots the way you want to. So
right.
So you'd say don't be afraid to be picky with your wood.
Yeah,
definitely legacy. I think is sort of like that. That's who, in my mind, that's who we do our work for, is for those generations to come.
What do you see as the way forward as far as language goes? You're doing so much work with Halkaminum, Squamish, Puntlatch. How do we keep that work going? You're in the phase of gathering words. It sounds like constructing sentences and learning how the mechanics of the language. But then how do we keep that snowballing on itself to revitalize it or to help ensure that it survives? Because this is probably the most important time in history for those languages.
So my initial work with the school district, there was one school I was mostly at, and I would teach every single class in that school. There was 9 classes, and I would teach them all Halkaminum from K to 7, so kindergarten to 12 years old. And starting off, like I sort of had this base curriculum idea in mind to teach all of these different classes, and my big goal was to see the kindergartners, by the time they're in grade 7, being able to have fluent conversations in Halkaminum. And I honestly think that we were on that direct path to get that to be a reality, and then the pandemic hit and entirely shifted the way we taught language. Initially, it was a real logistical nightmare being able to go working between 2 different schools. And then on top of that was the trying to teach different sounds. Trying to teach Halkaminum through a mask became the other really difficult part, because there's so many unique little sounds. If you don't quite say it properly, you wind up you're not teaching it right then.
I think we all understand that learning a language needs person-to-person connection, work with your physical environment. It's pretty tough to learn on something like off a computer or in a book. Those are great as supplements. But yeah, learning a language needs to be kind of face-to-face. Yeah, I would say. It's very agree. Intimate outside of certain things.
One of my favorite, calls to action or ways of support, which is something I had heard Ronnie Dean Harris say at a protest. And he said something like, find something you're passionate about. Pick your thing that you're passionate about. Because we all are passionate, or hopefully passionate about something, right? Find that thing and do your best that you can do with that, because definitely your skill here right now, coming and doing this podcast with us, this interview, and listening to stories and finding your way to share that will make an impact. Jesse's way of carving and interacting with people, that's what he's passionate about, that's his way of sharing. And I know there's many other people that have those skills, like whether it be like grant writing or teaching or making films or making music or working with elderly people or working with little kids, like all the different things that we become passionate about. Do that, because the way that we need support for our language we need more time, but that isn't necessarily an option. We do need more of our people involved in this, and it's more complicated than just saying, come and do that. Sometimes it requires healing. We need people to help our people heal from their traumas and how they feel that shame around our culture. We need that healing aspect. We need funding. We need jobs in order to help them have a stable environment so that they could do this work in a good way. So there's many ways that we could ask for people to be involved or help. So I like that call to action of find what you're passionate about and do your best you can with that to carry yourself in a good way and make good impacts that way, because that will just ripple out. Because what we need is time. The way that we look at the world is different from the Western world, and so negotiating that is very tricky, but funding and support in the ways that you know how, because it's going to be complicated. Like if you don't have a skill for something to then be asked to do that, but you have this other skill that you're really good at and you could do that, like record people and chop up all these sounds and
do what you're doing, which is interesting. And I always think you're at the forefront of it in that practicing culture. Doing your artwork is a way to practice culture at the same time. Obviously everybody can't adapt to that, to do that. Not everybody has, the skill or the ambition to be an artist, but it's almost like language is the easiest, most translatable way to bring your culture to everyday work and would allow you to be an accountant. And actually, if you had the language component, you would be practicing your culture at the same time. You could do anything. And I think that's what's maybe the most, to me, why I'm so passionate about revitalizing language and getting it out there and making sure people are practicing it and keeping it alive. And I think I love your call to action. I also know that the healing centers, creating healing centers, that's one of the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we have Indigenous led and constructed healing centers. And it would be a shame if language wasn't a core component of those language centers or of those healing centers. And I think that's a huge opportunity to start bridging that second phase of healing and what that might mean. This is just me riffing on thoughts, but that to me is the most exciting thing. And if people see value in that, and I ask you about your legacies because you're really doing this hard work of revitalizing these languages, but to bring it forward, it's as simple as resources. It's as simple as cash on the table to be able to create these facilities, build the organization, create a bit of administration, to be able to make this just a normal part of people's lives. And, you're working really hard, Jesse, at the school, teaching K-7. That needs to be scaled. We can't rely on Jesse, the lone warrior, to be in there teaching K-7 Halkaminum to some kid that'll listen. It has to be treated more seriously than that. No matter what part of this you value, I feel that language is a core component of the healing and the next phase, and also working through all these complexities. Culture is king, and culture will take, regardless of how somebody's writing a treaty or filling out their income tax or giving you a fishing license or whatever that looks like, culture will trump that. If you can, and you get enough people, the whole thing will shift. And I think that's so needed, and I think it's needed by everybody. It's exciting. It's an exciting time. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think it's always important to remember that as part of our healing processes. I know it can be difficult for people at times when they're experiencing a lot of self-doubt and a lot of sort of negative feelings towards the work, when something feels like Kafkaesque, when everything seems so murky and like there's no direction. Our people, we have our culture, and this entire world around us all has an aspect of culture that's in existence. The trees have a culture, and the rocks have a culture, and the ferns have a culture, and the slugs have a culture. All of these different things that exist in some sort of context with some sort of sense of purpose. And there's a way that when we recognize that everything's got a purpose, that everything's got a job in life, the things that they do, we have to make sure to remind ourselves that we have our purposes too. We have our things that make us feel good. These things that we call our passions. And if we ever feel that we're so unimportant as a slug, we have to remember that slugs have their work. They have things that they're passionate about, things that they apply to their world. And we have to remember that we carry with us those things that carry us forward in our world. We may not all be an artist. We may not all be a storyteller, but there are those things that sort of help us, give us that strength. And it's important for us to remember that, as we're starting to feel down anywhere. And maybe the solution just becomes to go take a walk in the forest, go sit by the beach and watch the birds fly, watch the seals play, watch the waves roll, and know that there's that important work that we all do. And it's something that we have to remember to carry along with us and pass down to our young people, and not even just our young people, but our people who need help, because it's not always just young people that need that kind of assistance.
Do you feel shame sometimes of your indigeneity?
Not so much as I did when I was younger. And I know I'd had those moments before where I kind of like, oh, I got to go and do this. Oh. Or I'd try and pretend that I wasn't, so I could be like one of the other kids in the school, because like the Qualicum Beach is it's a very Caucasian community.
White bread and mayonnaise.
Yep, that's basically it. In Qualicum Beach, the minorities are minorities. So that that did lead to a lot of kind of like me wanting to be, no, I don't want to be Indigenous. I want to just kind of be like everybody else, and just sort of came to be that it wasn't something I could run away from. I had to sort of face that part where I am who I am, and sort of that thought of shame. That shame isn't going to change the blood that runs in my veins, and it's not going to change that I have a card in my wallet that says I am a status Indian of Canada. And so it did take a lot of work for me to move beyond that and accept that as who I am. This is who I am. I really hope that people who do feel that still can move beyond that and sort of accept that part of themselves and understand the value that brings, because it really is a really valuable way to understand who you are and understand your connection to the land. Knowledge of our connections is deep. Those roots run deep. They're old. Some of those old trees may not be standing anymore, but the power of the roots in those trees is still in the ground, and they're still connected to who we are. It's not like that the way we look that defines our indigeneity. As you talked before, like it's our connection to our world, through our language, through our art, through our families, through our culture, the ways that we were brought up, and the things that we belong to. So, do I feel shame now? No. Did I feel shame before? Yes.
What do you think, Ocean?
I think that has encompassed a lot of the different background in the work that goes into just being Indigenous. The things that we have to move through each day and remember each day, and the ways that we remind ourselves why we're doing what we're doing, and the things that we remember to bring with us in the work that we do, and the reminder how to let go of those things that we don't need to carry with us. We don't need to carry that shame. We do definitely need to remember that we carry our names, we carry where we come from, we carry the land and the waters that we come from, to carry that and share that energy into the work that we do. But we don't need to hold on to that shame, that we're allowed to take the time to heal, because it'll make that work that we do so much stronger.
I think, over the years, I'm really grateful for the connections that I've made. in the different worlds that sort of I've been able to interact with, the different opportunities that have sort of come along that have allowed me to be an artist and allowed me to be a language worker. Because all those, even some of even the negative experiences that we've come across and the like acts of racism that have sort of affected myself and others in the communities, because they all teach us something, and they all give us that space for reflection and to know that those negative parts aren't a part of us, that they aren't the work that we're carrying unless we choose to carry it. Like, we choose the things that we hold on to. My uncle once taught me you got to be like a sponge, and you just hold on to the things that feel right for you, and those negative things you gotta let go. That's one of the ways of looking after yourself. Because if you're always sort of carrying that resentment that you might have towards something someone might have said to you years ago, that's you that's choosing to hold on to that stuff. When you like squeeze that sponge and you let it out, you let it out, you leave it out. You let yourself carry your work forward. Because there's a lot of barriers that we come across as Indigenous artists and as language workers. Sources of funding, the people we come across in those different worlds. Everybody's got their story, and we have to do our work to make sure that we're looking after ourselves so that we can do the work we need to do.
What do you hope your work's doing in the world, Ocean?
I hope it impacts people in a good way. I hope when I create art and people connect to it or observe it, and it reminds them of ways that they're connected to the land or connected to their culture or connected to their way of moving through this world, that is good, and it is inspirational to do the same thing, to share what they have to share from that place of love. And that people are able to hear what they need to hear. Sometimes my mom or my aunt would say, sometimes, I think our Uncle Bob was a really important guy in our life. So my mom has told me lots of stories about my Uncle Bob. She said sometimes he'd just show up. He'd start talking, start telling you a story, and you'd kind of be like, what is he saying? Like, I didn't really ask him a question about that. But he'd be talking, and then like, okay, have a nice day, and then he'd leave. And then you'd be going about your day and go, I really needed to hear that today. That you're willing to listen to people and you're willing to share out of that place of love, so that we're all able to share those things that we need to hear. And act out of that place of love. My cousin Cedars would always say, don't be afraid to tell people that you love them. And so after he said that, I remember to always tell my loved ones that I love you whenever I'm leaving. And so if that's what you needed to hear today, to act out of love and share the goodness that you have, because sometimes that's all that somebody needs to hear. They need to hear that I love you, or they need to see that beautiful thing that you created, or listen to the podcast, or see that carving, or be gifted that thing, or learn how to say that word in our language, like learn how to use a phrase from our language, like how to say "Aitnetith," like good morning, or "Haichka," like how to say thank you. Like, always be willing to share with love, because you never know what one thing that you may be able to share that somebody needs to hear.
That's nice.
So there's different ways to present yourself in that way,
and I love the flexibility of the protocol as well, between people and between cultures. I fairly recently learned how to do bathe in a cultural way. Mm-hmm. And that protocol also included, a lot of flexibility to do it in a way that was more meaningful or seemed to make more sense to you. And I appreciate that. I think that's like a really, some people just go in and they're like, bloop, 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 and that's it. And they're out of there. And then, some days you just need to be in there longer. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate like that there's all this room for expression within the culture. And I think if anything, I would encourage everybody interested in culture to understand that part. Like it doesn't have to be scary. You know, I know people that are so scared of the big house because they're scared of messing up, and it costs, you know, like you have to be on your best when you're in the big house, but that shouldn't deter you from engaging in culture. Not every day is a big house day, right? Like, so yeah, it's anyways, that's just like a little thing that I really appreciate the most about learning about protocol, and is that there is this flexibility for expression and for understanding things in a way that makes sense to you. That's cool.
Just like the world around us, like there's strict laws and rules of way things work, but there's also that flexibility. Just because that flower bloomed there one year doesn't mean it will bloom again the next year. Maybe it will pop up in another spot, like camas. Like sometimes it'll pop up here and then it moves, pops up here.
Right.
There's still that flexibility for that context, that unique context of what may be happening and who's involved and why it happened. But there's still those pillars of our ways of being that we can always come back to, but there's also that flexibility in it that, like our protocol for change, like the way that Splash had talked to me about the protocols of change, like when they first had guns around, like what are your cultural protocols for change of things of happening? Like this world we live in now is like unrecognizable to our ancestors 10,000 years ago. What would, over time, our protocols of change look like? We still have that flexibility of growing. Yeah. We're not just stagnant, stuck in one place. We have the ability to grow and adapt, but still hold on to those pillars of ways of being.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you both. I love you both. You're so cute together.
We're like the same person sometimes.
Yeah, it's really great, and I really appreciate getting a little bit of your perspective today and sharing that. And I know it can be nerve-wracking. How do I say, so Hechka is Alkaminum?
Yeah.
To say thank you. How do I say it in Squamish?
Hoichuka.
Hoichuka.
Slightly similar, but slightly different.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Zach. This has been great. Really
I
enjoyed
always
it.
love talking about art and culture and language.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about Jesse and Ocean's work and perspectives. To connect with them, you can find them online in the show notes below. Please do that and send some love their way. I continue to be heartened by your warm letters of support and compliments for the podcast. It's always so much fun to hear from you and read your thoughts. You can connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn at The Ranger Cabin, and find all the episodes at therangercabin.com. Thank you so much for leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or whatever platform you listen on. It's super helpful to get the word out and hold people up. Until next time, keep your fire hot. I'll be thinking of you. I'm Zach Whyte, and this is The Ranger Cabin.